Nature is the next frontier in planetary health. This time right now is not about the world ending due to climate change. This time right now is about the beginning of global regeneration and planetary health. In this conversation with Walter Jehne, world renowned microbiologist, and Stephen Curtin, an incredible filmmaker who really focuses on restoring balance in the Earth's ecosystems and people, we go deep into how, when we work with nature, it is possible to regenerate and live in harmony and experience planetary health on a global level. I'm Natalie Forstbauer, founder and editor-in-chief of Heart and Soul magazine. Enjoy the conversation. Thank you, Stephen and Walter, for joining me today. I'm really excited to connect with both of you. The piece you did on fungi versus, help me out, fungi versus...
fire versus fungi. Fire versus fungi.
Is brilliant. It was so beautifully done. And
thank you.
And yeah, I love the questions that were poised in it, and I loved the story that was told in it, and it felt like it gave a lot of hope to humanity. It gave a lot of hope to the earth, and it gave a lot of hope to the possibility of global regeneration. So I want to thank you for that messaging, and thank you for giving all of us hope.
No, well, yes, you deserve it. And absolutely, that's what we're in the business. Yeah, no, look, that's very much what we're doing, right? It's regenerate Earth. And the answer is nature does it, and we can do it as well. But it's just up to our minds and our conscience. And when are we going to make the change? But yes, it's possible, right?
Yeah. So, Walter, tell me a little bit about, I want to talk to you a little bit about how you found yourself in soil science and actually in the conversation of water, and how they're connected. And then Stephen, I'd love to capture some of what your relationship with that is as well, and how you found yourself making amazing films and creativity out of it. So, Walter, can we start with you, and you can share with us?
Well, yeah. Look, as a little,
you landed here,
even as a young boy growing up in the bush, in the forest in Australia, very, very quickly, obviously that forest environment and the processes and stuff were really fundamental to me. I then actually did my first degree in forestry, right? So I'm a forester. But very much then specialized on soil and microbiology, because that's where the actual processes, driving systems, everything is governed. I was working then for about 15 years as a research scientist, looking at soil microbial ecology in terms of diseases, productivity, succession in Tasmania, which is a little island to the south of Australia, quite cool, but then also in tropical crops and pastures right up north, in the tropical savannas, and then was looking at, how do we use these microbial processes to regenerate degraded waste soil, because we've created 5 billion hectares of man-made desert and wasteland on this planet, and there's only 14 billion hectares of land, and we're not making more of it, right? So that's 40% down the drain. So it's a big challenge. But look, then I left and I actually joined in policy, strategic innovation futures in Australia at the pretty senior level, and working there for a long time with our government, but then retired about 15 years ago and really went back to more that scientific base, but this time with innovative farmers all over Australia, and really looking at, what are they doing in a positive, active, practical how-to, and really picking up those innovative leaders, which are then the gateways to the futures, the pathways to the future. Formed a thing called Healthy Soils Australia, but that's now grown into this bigger NGO, Regenerate Earth, because it's very rapidly gone bigger. As far as hydrology, look, Australia is the driest inhabited continent, So water is everything. And of course, life is water. And that's pretty harsh and fundamental here. But on the other hand, you see, we've got vast areas of desert, semi-arid rangeland, but it's still all green, right? It's still all vegetated because nature has come and innovated and adapted and has actually been able to maintain green deserts. So again, this is one of the messages of hope, that nature has solved all these really critical challenges, and it's only a matter of us taking the blinkers off our dogma and egos to say, look, how did she do this?
Yes.
And then we understand the processes and have a little bit of humility, practical community grassroots empowerment, then we can actually do that as well everywhere.
I love it. I love all of it. I have two questions. One is, what inspired you to go to the farmers after your retirement? And then the second part is, let's do that one first. What inspired you to go back to the
Natalie,
farmers?
okay, and this is global and particularly North America, and you're going under with it. Now, look, I've worked for 20 years with ministers, with the Prime Minister, at very senior level, looking at strategic innovation and how does Australia actually, get competitive, and, that whole innovative question. R&D, we used to spend billions and billions of dollars on R&D and stuff. And look, there's no question that our system can't change from above, because the politics of democracy, and nothing wrong with democracy, of course, we wish we had a bit more of it. America's blessing that as well. But the point is that, it's always playing to the short term, to the opportunistic, to the now, and really protecting and sustaining the status quo. And so if we're going to if we change, we're going to actually have to step beyond the status quo to go, where are the frontiers? And that, of course, is nature, right? We've got to go back to these natural systems. And of course, all my research, we knew that. Look, here's nature creating rainforests on sand dunes, within a space of 20 years. Here's nature creating the prairie soils from glacial waterlogged tills where you are, right? How does nature turn that muck into the world's most productive soils in the space of 8,000 years, right? So nature's showing us that, but for us to be in that mind space, in that paradigm, we've got to get away from the short term, and we've got to start saying, well, where are the innovative leaders? And of course, that's where the grassroots community farming situation is, but where these innovators are, the people, the 1%, 0.5%, who are willing to do different stunning things. You've got them in America, your Gabe Browns and David Johnsons and so forth, right? And my function then was to say, right, here are these innovators, but they're often eccentric, isolated individuals, have to have the bravery to do it. And basically, how do we help them put the science, the rigorous science behind what they're doing, but also put it into this bigger strategic policy context that politicians get it, that, these farmers, he or she is actually, they're really the cutting edges into the future, right? And it's not going to come from the status quo. Innovation doesn't come from the status quo by definition. So where are these uncut diamonds, and how do we actually bring them together, polish them up, and wow, we've got a tiara.
I love how you name that. And it really amplified the farmers, because I think for so long, because of the way we've evolved here on planet Earth with each other and with nature, farmers have been viewed very, very differently. So to see them as a grassroots movement, as in regeneration and working with nature and working with the earth, is really powerful. So the other part that I'm wondering and curious about is, how do we put our ego on the back shelf? How do we do that? And what questions do we need to be asking? And what do we need to be looking to in order to take the next steps forward?
Well, Natalie, in a sense, we're not in control as much as we think. Okay, so basically we've wasted 50 years, right? Talking, for example, about climate change. You know, Charles Skilling, 1960, there's the evidence. Hey, what more do you need, right? So we
My
wasted,
kids would agree with you.
50 years we've wasted just talk, denial, delay. We've spent $80 billion US on a UN IPCC process, just talk, modeling scenarios, but no solution, no action, right? They give us a Faustian bargain at the end. Okay, you can either have an economy on petrol, fossil fuels, or you can have collapse, right? And it's a no option. And so in a sense, it's not how do we change anymore. It's just that basically nature has now called us in. And with climate change, it's not just CO2, it's not just the rising temperatures, it's actually the dangerous hydrological extremes. The floods, the storms, the hurricanes, the droughts, the aridification, the wildfires, that are collapsing biosystems now in front of us. So, Fort McMurray was actually your, basic Arctic biosystems crashing, collapsing.
That's right.
And so nature's actually calling us in now. And it's really, this is serious now. We've only got basically a decade to actually wake up and now basically say, are we going to join her or are we going to ignore her and let her do it after we're gone?
So the question is, how do we join her?
Oh, well, okay. And we join her, but very simply, of course, by saying, well, where are her processes? Can we understand them? And yes, we all the science is there, fire versus fungi, for example. Actually, we'll use that in a second. So all the processes are there, and it's just a question of the awakening. How do we realize? So take fire versus fungi. You've got these 350 to 400 million hectares of forest burning every year globally, right? And more emissions from those fires than there is from all our use of fossil fuels. Not that we don't have to stop fossil fuel use, but here's those emissions. And basically, they're all driven by fuel. Fire is driven by the oxidation of that fuel. And yet nature has this beautiful process where she takes fungi and breaks that fuel down to make stable soil carbon and water, because that's what you do when you break down biomass, you get stable carbon and water. And of course, so you're turning the negative, the fuel that drives the destructive wildfires, and nature just beautifully turns it into positives: stable soil carbon, sponge, hydrology, water, cooling, rainforest. Okay, and it's just that simple fire versus fungi process transition. So the question comes very simply, what is it that is inhibiting the fungi from doing what they did naturally? What have we done in the forest that has now inhibited these fungi breaking down, removing that fuel, instead not building the soil carbon, the productivity that it drives? See, and so we've brought the whole thing down to that very simple question. How do we biostimulate those fungi ecologically in our forest to save them? You see, and so do you understand? We've taken that natural process and now we put it to us. You as a forest bower, how do we actually manage that fungal process? And of course, there's nothing new there. We've been, your ancestors would have been studying that in European forests for the last 400 years.
That's right.
And we know how to do it.
And what are some of the most effective ways to do that then?
Well, okay, now that becomes then a little bit, because there's not a simple Google prescription, right? Because that's forest specific. So yes, I would have to come to your forest and then look at, all right, how did nature do this naturally in your forest? What have we done to limit that process through our intervention and management, right? What's impeded it? And then how do we get our boot off her throat to let her basically, reestablish these natural processes? One of the fundamentals there is carbon nitrogen ratios, right? I mean, basically, litter is all carbon. It's all, carbon fuel. For it to break down, it has to have a carbon nitrogen ratio of about 20:1. Okay, so we need 1 unit of nitrogen for every 20 units of carbon. But the way we manage our forest, we've destroyed most of the nitrogen fixing in that forest. And so now we've got forest litters that are 100:1. And so, do you understand? We're impeding that balance. And then you say, how do I get the nitrogen back into them? You don't have to fertilize them, but you might just have to let animals come back in, because guess what? Animals were the natural nitrogen, because all the excreta from animals was actually turning biomass into fertilizer, right? And so what have we done to the animals in the forest and the ecology of those forests to impede the fungi?
So you were part of Healthy Soils Australia, and now it's going into Regeneration Earth. And can you tell me about that transition and the global scope? Like, why Regeneration Earth, and what are your next steps with it?
Well, look, I mean, it's a natural thing. What happened is that obviously we start with farmers, and the whole message is soil carbon and regenerating the Earth's soil carbon sponge, because that's a tool to hydrology. And hydrology is then cooling the planet safely and naturally and in time, right? So that transition, it's all hard science, a lot of physics, it's all there. And basically, of course, the messages then becomes, yes, soil is the agency, is the tool, but the objective is bigger now. It is regenerating Earth. It's regenerating these healthy systems. It's rebuilding hydrology, productivity, resilience. But above all, it's actually cooling and buffering regions in the planet in this 10 years, right? So soils are still our point of agency, and farmers, of course, but the objectives now globally, the imperatives are really up there in terms of, cooling and regreening and regeneration. And it's also gone global, right? I mean, basically, we're just innocent bystanders from down under, Australia, underground. But the point is the messages and the imperative is global. So we've got colleagues in New Zealand and India and Europe and Canada, right? So it's a global family, and if we can add support into that family, that's what we want to do.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love about what's happening right now, is there is a global regenerative conversation happening, and people really coming together and sharing what they've learned, what they've noticed, and how we can all link arms and join hands and rise and regenerate together. So I feel like you have something you want to share.
Sorry?
It felt like you had something you wanted to say.
Oh, look, I just wanted to say, and coming back to the carbon nitrogen, and that's why when Stephen's beautiful film, that's why the star of the film is actually the cassowary, right? You know, that big bird, that cassowary, and because it's a 2-meter high bird in our rainforests in North Queensland, it's actually a living dinosaur. I mean, it's a bit freaky if people think of it, but it is, there's no question. It is actually a living descendant of the dinosaur. It's exquisitely powerful, beautiful bird. But yeah, it grows the forest, right? It eats seeds, and the seeds only germinate in the excreta of the cassowary. It spends its whole life scratching in the litter for worms and insects, and that's what it's feeding off, right? As well as seeds. And of course, in that process, it's really composting and growing the forest. So really, it's the one you saw is your brother, because they're males. They're forest bowers, right? They are forest bowers in every sense, because the cassowaries grow Australia's rainforests, those tropical rainforests, through seeding them and through managing that fire versus fungi litter microbial process.
Oh, that's really cool. And how does that translate?
And they're very beautiful, like you see, Natalie. You can look at them and you say, look, they've got a blue neck, and they're really wonderful. So there,
you're sweet. Wonderful, like the two of you as well, which is the big flock of beautiful birds. Walter, how does that translate into farming? So what do farmers and gardeners do in their processes to nourish nature that you're talking about with the fire versus fungi in the forests?
Well, look, fire versus fungi translates in very directly back to forests. I mean, to farmers and practical action. And it's very simple. We call ABC, really. Like, okay, the bottom line is we grow plants to pull down carbon from the air, sunshine, CO2, water makes biomass. And that's what nature used from 3.5 billion years ago to actually create biomass, right? Life, the fuel for life. Okay, and so what we've got to maximize that, and as nature does, just regreen the planet. But then what the critical thing is, I mean, the really critical thing, and it's a bit more subtle, it's not how much we grow, it's what we do, what happens to every gram of carbon biomass that we fix. Okay? It's not growing it, it's what happens to it. And there's only two things in the universe for all of history that have happened to that carbon. It can either oxidize, burn back to CO2 instantly, or it can be bioconverted by fungi, largely, into stable soil carbon. Burn or go into sponge. Okay, so just think of it, every bit of green, every bit of biomass that's ever been fixed on this planet has either burnt or gone back into sponge. Either gone back to desert, degraded back to desert, desertified, or built more mesic, more productive biosystems. And that's your prairies, right? You start off with mineral waste and you build prairies. Or we can do the reverse. We can take prairies and put them back to deserts, right? You look at your oil fields, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so it's either that, it's just that simple. It's either, burn or biodegrade, fire versus fungi. And we are in control. We have agency on A, which is how much do we grow, the amount of photosynthesis. But most of all, we have agency over B and C. And not that either one of them is bad, but it's a balance, right? And at the moment, our oxidative industrial farming system is taking 120% of A back into CO2. Because as we clear land, burn land, over-cultivate, over-fertilize, use biocides, irrigation, and bare fallowing, all of those things are taking carbon from the soil back into the atmosphere. Okay, at prodigious rates, 120% of A, because it's taking both all of A plus 20% of heritage, historical carbon. And of course, it's a Jared Diamond. It's a definition for collapse. You can't avoid it. Civilizations last for about 300 years, and then they degrade their soils and they just collapse unless they go into warfare and raid somebody else's healthy soil. And that's been the story of civilizations. So so for farmers, it comes down simply, look, here are the stupidities, the oxidative, destructive things, and how do we do less of those and more of the fungi? So more of the cassowaries, and manage animals wisely, and actually look at those processes that help that microbial ecology. So that's just translating fire versus fungi down to farmers. Yes.
Yeah, you did that beautifully. I felt like I was on a journey with you, walking through the forest and through the garden. And
well, that's what you've been doing for 400 years, Natalie.
Going back in. Well, yeah, okay.
That's your namesake, right? It's you.
It is our nature. So what are some of the actual tactical practices that farmers are doing, though, to bring the sponge into the soil?
Well, look, and again, I don't want to be giving prescriptions, that everyone around the world runs off and has to do that. But it's site specific. It's actually what is limiting that, and then what can I do? But classically is grazing, for example, right? How do I
Mm-hmm.
basically bring animals back into the system so they are converting the biomass into biofertility, like into dung,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
removing it as a fuel and basically recreating that natural cycle. We call them, in a sense, mobile biodigesters, right? Especially for dry lands, grasslands, seasonally, harsh lands. Nature doesn't do the composting in situ across the ground because it gets too dry, too hard, too cold. So it invents these mobile biodigesters, these mobile compost heaps, and we call them herbivores, right?
That's right.
And you had the bisons and the elk and the moose, and hey, guess what? They're all around you. And now you can replace them with cattle, but then it's a matter of managing those animals wisely so they don't overgraze and degrade, right? And then rotating them and that whole ecology, yeah.
So it sounds like the answers are more in the questions than in the prescriptions.
Yes, I think it's the questions and the understanding of the balance of those systems, and yeah, it's really getting into the groove back with nature, with forest building, right? And and what were the processes, and how do we tweak these processes?
Yeah.
Another one is cover cropping, right? And so, okay, we're talking now about the 5 billion hectares of man-made desert, and all these deserts were once savanna rangelands, right? And so how do we turn some of them back into rangelands? And yes, we can. Yes, we must. And so now the question is, how do we bring seed and the microbial ecologies back into some of those degraded wastelands and regenerate them? And yes, we can. And that's a big part, because the more we can cover green across this planet, the more we've got cooling of the soils, the more we've got reduced re-radiation, which drives the greenhouse effect, and the more we can cool the planet. And that's critical.
So I just lost my thought. It'll come back though. That's a lot of land that has been desertified, and I hear a lot. We have 10 years. We have this many years. 10 years seems to be a really common number right now. And at what rate do we have to really, like, at what shift does humanity, and do we have to change the way we're farming and the way we're living in order to reach?
Well, look, this is
generation.
Okay. No, understand, and don't be despondent, because basically the old Chinese proverb sort of asked the same questions. When is it the best time to plant a tree? And the answer is 20 years ago, right? And when's the second best time? Now. And if we're in the second best, let's use it, right? But look, yes, but it's more important than asking the area. It's really a case of how do we empower people, right? Because if people get them, if films like Stephen's film can get the message across, and if we can empower people at the grassroots everywhere, and then every balcony, every courtyard, every nature strip, every urban ecology, urban agricultural, setup, if that's sort of empowering them to do more green and to do more biodigestion rather than burning, yes, we can. But so it's not a matter of we've got this massive target, we can't get there in 10 years. We have to start the journey and say, look, if we've got we're going to have 10 billion people on this planet by 2050, 10 billion people. 7 billion of them will be in cities, right? Concentrated in cities, totally vulnerable, food, water, biosystems, stability. And so, if we can, urban agriculture, for example, enormously powerful. How do we help them, empower them to take charge of their own destiny in urban agriculture, produce 50% of their food, but also regreen their habitats, cool their habitats? It's all doable. And they just have to watch Stephen's film,
Yes, yes, we can. And I love how you named presence as the I'll say the currency of empowerment, because it really is. It is a now movement. It's not in 10 years or in 5 years. We only have this much time. It's what are we doing today, and how can we empower and bring information and bring tools and resources and practices to people.
Yeah. Now, look, on other fronts, like we're working actually with Vijay Kumar in India, Andhra Pradesh, and it's again very dry, semi-arid, partly, it's the wasteland there. And yeah, there's some very innovative processes where we're saying, look, yes, we can come back and help regreen these arid areas. Now, we're not making promises, but if these innovative practical processes work, then can we take 1-2 billion hectares of that wasteland and put a green cover crop carpet back across it? Technically, yes, we can, right? 1 billion hectares is basically 1.2 United States in terms of area, right? So it's a lot of land. 5 billion hectares of desert is a lot of land. But the point is, like doing 1 billion hectares of regreening through these arid zone regeneration strategies has a profound effect in terms of re-radiation, greenhouse, and then cooling safely, naturally, hydrologically cooling the planet.
And I love how I watched some of your talks. I loved how you I don't know how you named about how when we change the way that we work with nature, and we change the way that we farm and the way that we have forests and what we put into the earth. And I mean by basically you say that we can make it rain, like literally you can change the and I thought, and you did that so well. Clearly I'm not doing it eloquently, but I'd love for you just to touch on that, because I think people would appreciate hearing that.
Well, look, and it's, again, this is where you've got to go back to nature, because if you, well, okay, just give you a bit of history. We were doing a lot of very, very leading work globally in the 60s and 70s, and CSIRO was working on cloud seeding and, driest inhabited continent, and very successfully, very successfully getting up to 30% more rain because we were seeding these clouds. But of course, then it became political, and of course there'd be a drought somewhere, and then the politicians would get rung up to say, "Get those scientists here. We need them to make rain." You see, and the politicians basically said, "Look, this is a no-win situation because, we can't just make it rain like that." And of course, they're going to lose credibility because hey, they didn't make it rain. And of course, they closed the program partly because it was a political liability, right? Because there wasn't the certainty, the absolute hubris of humans being able to make it rain. But nature works like that. Now, look, it's very simple that basically, as plants transpire, they take water up from the earth into the air, and that's cooling the planet enormously, but that water has to come back down. And for that rain to occur, you have to actually nucleate that humid water vapor and the hazes and the micro droplets in the air, and there's a lot of physics there, but you've got to basically nucleate them and form raindrops large and heavy enough to fall out as rain. And there's only 3 things in nature that do that. Ice crystals, in cold, high latitude, high altitude environments. So ice crystals, they're hygroscopic. And over the oceans, there's salt, obviously, because salt's hygroscopic, absorbs things. But over most lands, tropical areas, and particularly inland areas, by far the most important thing, and probably driving 60-70% of the Earth's rainfall, are bacteria. And these are far, far more hygroscopic than ice or salt. They really are suckers. They suck in the thing because of their biochemistry. And we know all the physics and the biochemistry of this. And basically, they then suck in this moisture to create the raindrops. So these are the precipitation nuclei. And Louis Pasteur described them back in the 1880s, right? 1870s, 1880s. Called them aerobacter orogenes, which means aerobacter, of course. Orogen means what the hell are they doing up there? Well, that's Greek, right? But the point is that, here is these bacteria, and of course they drive 60 to 70% of the rainfall, for example, in the Amazon, right? Because that rainfall it's a symbiotic biological process. So nature, do you understand? Plants don't just rely on rain, plants are generating rain. These forests, back to your ancestors, the forest bowers, right? Any plant, not just any plants. We're now talking about, and there's a lot we don't know in detail here, but it's the actual mature forests, right, of different types. And they're generating this rain. We clear those forests, and hey presto, we've got all the evidence in the world that we clear those forests and bang, we go back to semi-arid wasteland.
Yeah, we do.
And
well,
then
thank you.
The other positive side, and we can thank Charles Darwin and Hooker for this, we can actually also grow forests, regenerate wasteland with forests, and we can regenerate this rainfall. And on Ascension Island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, Hooker and Darwin, way back in, again, 1880s, set up an experiment. They've got two mountains. They've got Bald Mountain and Green Mountain. That's what they named the experiment, their control. And guess what? Green Mountain, gets 20% more rainfall than Bald Mountain, which is only like a couple of kilometers away.
It's amazing.
You see,
amazing.
And who's going to argue with Charles Darwin, right?
That's right. That's right. And what I love, Walter, is just all the examples that you're giving, because I think it makes it makes regeneration, global regeneration, and the possibility of just allowing nature to emerge that much more possible. It's not like it's like you said, we don't actually have as much control as we think we do, and at the same time we do have influence, possibly, by the way we grow our food and the food that we choose to eat and the way that we interact with nature.
And look, your question is so prescient, you see, because you said, how could we possibly do it in 10 years? And the answer is we can't. But if we get our boot off her throat, nature can.
That's right.
So that's the whole message. If we, don't have the hubris of thinking we can, but we can re-empower these natural processes, look after our friends, the cassowaries and the turkeys and all the other, biota. And basically it can very rapidly, as Charles Darwin showed us, regreen, rehydrate, cool and buffer what we're otherwise facing as collapse.
That's powerful. In 1989, I was born and raised on an organic farm, and in 89 they bought a farm that had been farmed conventionally, and it had been sprayed very heavily as well. And I remember when I first went to work with the land and picking it up in my hands and just thinking, what does my dad see in this? Because it was so lifeless. And I was used to picking up handfuls of soil that were full of microbes and worms and you name it, it was crawling in it. And then this dry, lifeless soil. And then we got to see it come back to life. And that was probably one of the most transformational experiences of my life. And then we brought some of the soil to a presentation. I think anyways, it was a soil microbiologist who's very well renowned, and I really appreciate all the work. And they wanted to know what my dad had done to it, and my dad was like, of course we farmed organically and biodynamically, but my dad was just like, we just, it was nature, we didn't do anything special to it, we just let it do what it did. And that was a really powerful learning for me, because it made me pause that nature, that the earth and the soil will actually heal itself if we give it space to.
Again, it's just, we live above the ground in our own egos, but if we look at a plant, you see, basically it's really functioning below the ground.
Mhm.
30% of the biomass is above the ground, sure, but another 30% is in the roots and 40% is in the root exudates, all the sugars that leach out. And
Mhm.
those 40% of exudates, they're wasted, quite the opposite. They're feeding that community of soil organisms, right? The
Mhm.
fungi and the bacteria and the actinomyces, the whole
Mhm.
food ecology.
Mhm.
There's up to 25,000 kilometers of fungal hyphae per cubic meter of healthy soil. So the soils that your father then created, 25, that's twice the diameter of the earth of fungal hyphae per cubic meter of that soil. And it's all basically solubilizing nutrients and cycling organic matter. Do you understand? So you've got this powerful force multiplier of microbial ecology driving the productivity, the biofertility, the resilience of that soil. So, your father and your mother and you don't have to do anything. You've got these
Mhm.
workers, it's do you understand? They're not workers,
Yeah,
but you've got life basically on your side.
that's
And,
right.
that's twice the diameter of the earth per cubic meter working on your behalf, right? So you
Yeah.
got friends.
Yep, so true.
They're called fungi.
I dropped my I
Oh,
dropped my
okay. Yeah.
my earpiece.
Big-
Stephen, I want to switch. I want to shift to hearing more about your story. And how did you come to meet Walter, and how did you come to be interested in regeneration and soil health and earth
Sure.
health?
Well, one of our colleagues, Peter Leppert in Regenerate Earth, introduced me to Walter a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And listening to, I guess, the different moving parts of planetary ecology is what really struck me, and just very much driven by curiosity that can we turn back the clock? Can we have these amazingly rich biosystems and natural systems? And that was, I'll come back to that in a minute, and that was very much driven by, so I'm standing up here in the Australian Alps at the moment, which is less than 1% of our Australian continent. If you just dropped out there.
Yeah, you're back.
Still there.
Mm-hmm.
And I've spent many years up in this tiny, if you like, island of alpine goodness, which supplies at least 40% of the water into our major Murray-Darling Basin, in which our mates, some of Australia's capital cities depend so much for their water supply. And it's largely through lots of time in the bush, like Walter was saying, as a young person, and then studying environmental science, and then moving into conservation journalism, and then making films. I'm very lucky to do that with the BBC Natural History Unit, and then understanding that the power of story, of course, backed by science, is really powerful and really important to remind people of, look, what are the building blocks of life, and what can we bring to that? And an example of this, understanding the different parts of planetary ecology, which is very much a passion for me here right now in the Alps, is our Alps, of course, are influenced by the power of the Southern Ocean and Antarctica. And I've been very fortunate to work as a guide down south, and to look into the eye of a humpback whale.
Wow.
Closer than I am now to you. Like, it's basically a foot a foot away.
Wow.
And then there is something with looking into the eye of a wild beast, and understanding how, as we're understanding as a narrative with Regenerated Earth, can whales cool Antarctica? I might let Walter add to that, but it's very much this this my own curiosity to, as I say, to can we restore these amazing systems upon which we all depend, of course.
Yeah, look, Natalie, it's so powerful and seems so important because see, it's really communicating, but it's also giving people license to explore, to wonder, and to be amazed, right? And here's a scientist, and they're always up there in their nerdy sort of white coats and stuff. But really, but really, it's more important to say, look, here's an 8-year-old child, and ask the question, can whales cool Antarctica? And really the audacity of those questions. Can we dream? Can we actually do this? And empowering people to, think and step beyond their confines and limitations, especially at that age, because what we do as a society, we're just straitjacketing them into, school and all the rigor and dogma. And so if we can ask these audacious questions, but then go through the simple natural logic, of course whales can, and they do, because they excrete, and that excreta produces phytoplankton. That phytoplankton, of course, feeds a whole global marine food chain, but also produces dimethyl sulfide and aerosols. And James Lovelock back in the 60s said, look, these are the things that create the clouds. These are these aerosols that actually nucleate the clouds. And of course, with the evolution of whales, then Antarctica formed because it created basically a cloud band around the southern oceans that was so thick that it basically reflected much of that incident solar radiation back out to space and created a much, much cooler habitat, whereas previously there'd been rainforest on Antarctica, that then cooled Antarctica, right? Now, what we did in the 19th century, of course, we took away 98% of the world's whales because we used them for ladies' corsets in Massachusetts and oil lamps in the Northeast, right?
Yeah.
Do you understand? But Moby Dick told us all about it. Basically, we decimated 98% of the whales, and with that, we've changed ecosystems, right? Because here's a scientific chain, whale poo, phytoplankton, aerosols, food chains, clouds, cooling. And now the question is, can whales cool Antarctica? Did whales cool Antarctica? I mean, there's wonderful questions, but here's the science, you see. And can we, by restoring whales, help recreate that, right? And so it's asking this, having the license of freedom and excitement to ask these questions, to go step beyond the dogma, the status quo. We're doomed, we're doomed, we're doomed, right? You've got to be a lawyer, or you've got to be a stockbroker or something like that, to say, look, here are mind-opening adventures for young children. And that's where communications, you, Stephen, is so important, right?
Yeah, really, really important. And so what are
to dream? Give license to dream.
I love that, license to dream and license to be curious. And what are some of the other living questions that you sit with every single day?
Well, in the same parallel, okay, again, come back to our friend Charles Darwin in the Seychelles in 1836, and basically did it all. You see, we had sea level rise, and there's these coral atolls. And those coral atolls, by definition, over the last 6,000 years, have had to grow up 200 meters with a sea level rise to still be there, right? So, for example, can we grow coral atolls faster than sea level rise? Of course we can. Coral atolls are biological organisms. The sand is calcium carbonate, the biologically derived sand. So can we grow sand faster than sea level rise? Of course we can. So then we sort of say, well, what's limiting growing of these sands? And the answer is yes, here's the limiting factors, the calcium, et cetera, et cetera. And right, how do we do that? And yes, we can grow coral atolls faster than sea level rise. We can regenerate and re-green these islands. By regreening the islands, this is a beautiful thing. Of course, what happens, we create forests. We've got all these seabirds, and they're flying around the oceans eating fish and what have you. But at the end of the day, they want to rest, don't they? So where can they rest? They have to find a little island with trees to rest. And so they come back into that island, and that's where they excrete all their daily, food. So where's the concentration of calcium from the oceans back onto these islands to grow, to accelerate the growth of those coral sands, the calcium carbonate, because calcium input is limiting the production of the reefs, right?
Right. I'm just grinning from ear to ear. I know. Well, yeah, right. I'm just grinning from ear to ear, Walter, because I'm really grateful to be having this conversation with you and Stephen, because I think that even your presence, the presence that both of you hold, is enough for people to feel inspired and feel hopeful about what they can do differently. And it's really uplifting. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you think is really important?
Well, look, what we haven't talked about is you and exactly what you'd like to do with all of this. And in a sense, how do we help you on your journey and, enrich and empower and color what you want to do, right?
Well, thank you. I for sure want to collaborate with you more. And before we go there, can you tell us more about Regenerate Earth and how we can support that initiative and how you see that?
Well, look, Regenerate Earth is a little charity, NGO, not-for-profit organization. It's really a brand under which we and then progressively other colleagues from around the world can work, because it's Earth, it's nature, it's not us. We don't want to promote ourselves, right? That's counterproductive. So it's really, look, here is nature, here is Earth, and then really it's the umbrella under which we work, but it's a completely clean, benign little not-for-profit. We're charity. I mean, we just put together a site that Stephen's had enormous input into, so that's wonderful, and other, really kind volunteers. And we've got to be in this communication game, because this raises so many questions. But as we agree that the 8-year-olds will say, where do I go to read and explore this next? And so we collectively have to sort of enrich their dreams, right? We've got to sort of basically have, where's the information? And so, we're very keen to use Regenerate Earth as a platform for that communication, right?
That's awesome. That's good to know. That's very aligned with Heart and Soil, because that's really what I want. That's what inspired me to do Heart and Soil, is I wanted to create a global conversation around regeneration. And we are, with a focus on farming and gardening, like regenerative or planetary health through farming and gardening. And at the same time, to me, farming and gardening isn't just the food that we grow or the soil that we grow it in. It's how we live our life, how we look after ourselves, how we show up, how we interact. Like it's a very holistic picture to me. And part of that is historically, we've been led to believe or understand that farmers often aren't very good at looking after themselves. And so I want to help change that story too, so that we're not just looking at global regeneration through the way that we show up to look after the earth, but it's how we look after ourselves too, because the more we can look after ourselves holistically and like honoring that piece, I think the more that we can show up consciously and intentionally for others and for the earth.
Yeah, look, and it's too big a topic for today, but basically a lot of our focus is on urban agriculture, because again, that's where the people are, but also that's where the imperative is, because look, over the last 70 years, we've lost 2/3 of the nutritional integrity in the food we eat. And of course, that's directly associated with our self-induced diet-related diseases, right? And they're the things that, again, bringing us down. And so urban agriculture is terribly important in re-empowering, restoring that nutritional integrity in our food chains and the whole preventative health, of this post-pandemic world we're in, or not even post, it's going to keep on going. And so, look, that's another whole heart and soil message, because it's urban agriculture. It's actually the committed parents, grandparents, children, all over the world saying, look, health matters, it's life, and we can empower our health through our soil, through our food management, and we have to do that. But that's another whole world to talk about.
It is, and I'd love to have a conversation with you about it. Our next issue is actually called Gardening Hacks, and it's for backyard gardeners and for people who wanting to get their hands dirty in the soil.
I've got several workshops and webinars that bringing that discussion to the fore at a technical level, or quasi-technical level, but again, it's a bit like, can whales cool Antarctica? It's putting a thing out there, but then to do justice to it, we have to go through and say, yes, look, here are the building blocks, the stepping stones of the journey through the science to substantiate fully.
That's right.
How real it is, right?
Yeah. And Stephen, is there anything that we haven't talked about that's really important to you?
Not especially, but I would just like to invite your readers, listeners, to be equally as curious and to ask those big questions. And what I studied in environmental science placed me in good stead, but it's this what I've learnt in recent times is the wisdom of all those great people that have come before us that have, for whatever reason, slipped off the radar. For example, James Lovelock and Mr. Darwin, and to look into I guess those ecological truths, if you like, and to connect that with what's the big picture in one's local area. What can we look at that can restore, if you like, a balance and health in one's local area.
Yes. Yeah. I love that. Good questions. And I like what you're leaving people thinking about. So thank you for that.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you. It's great. It's fun.
Yeah. And Stephen, I'm also curious, what are your next projects? What are you working on right now, and how can we support you?
Look, it's largely through Regenerate Earth.
Okay.
So look, it's just to keep tabs there, but a local project on which Walter and I and other great colleagues in alpine ecology is, look, this behind me is the Australian Alps. I've mentioned the Alps a few times, and it's just such a, apart from being a very beautiful landscape, it's just so important for the supply of water in Southeast Australia. And of course, in recent years, in California and further north, we have these wildfire events. Is a new film on our highest mountain here. It's not very high by world standards, Mount Kosciuszko, and looking at how can we cool, rehydrate our alpine landscape to reduce wildfire incidents and to increase soil hydrology. So that's in the pipeline.
Exciting.
And of course, it has a parallel, of course, for similar areas all across the world. Is how can we rehydrate and cool these wild landscapes, of which the building blocks are, in essence, this similar or the same, in one's backyard.
Good questions. I cannot wait to see what you produce.